Welcome back to the third part of Chapter 10. So in this module, we are going to talk about adolescence, which should be fairly familiar to you, considering for a lot of you it's probably the most recent phase of your life that you've been through. And it's not going to be a very long module. I don't have a ton to say about it, but we'll basically just go through some of the major changes and influences that occur during adolescence. So it should only take us, maybe 15-20 minutes max, if that. And then we will move on to adulthood and we'll be finished with this chapter. So, Module 10.3 is just named Adolescence. First, we'll talk about some of the physical changes in adolescence because, of course, those are some of the most prominent features that you'd probably notice. So, the physical transition from childhood to adolescence begins with the onset of puberty. It occurs at approximately age 11 in girls and age 13 in boys, but of course we know that that's very variable depending on the person. Hormones such as estrogen and testosterone contribute to the development of both the primary sex traits, such as the enlargement of the genitals, the onset of ejaculation with sperm and menstruation, and then the secondary sex traits, such as pubic hair and lowering of a voice, things like that. So basically the primary sex traits are those that are directly related to reproduction, whereas the secondary sex traits are those changes in the body during adolescence that are not part of reproduction. So in females, menarche, which is the onset of menstruation, typically occurs around age 12, and in males, spermarche, which is the first ejaculation of sperm, typically occurs around age 14. Again, those are very variable depending on the person, so not every person is going to go through puberty at the same rate or at the same time, but those are just kind of the average times in which those things tend to occur. Puberty now does tend to happen much earlier than it used to. So if you compare the average age of puberty now to the average age, 10, 20, 50 years ago, it has been decreasing in terms of the average age of onset. There might be kind of a variety of factors that could influence it, such as changes in diet and obesity rates and, physical activity, things like that. There's a lot of things that might influence whether or not people are undergoing puberty sooner than in the past. So here are some of the physical changes in adolescence, which again I'm sure you're all familiar with. So for men, a lot of the time they'll grow facial hair, maybe chest hair, underarm hair, pubic hair, enlargement of the penis, scrotum, and testes, and ejaculation, specifically with sperm. Whereas for females, they tend to have the underarm hair, breast development, pubic hair, enlargement of the genitals, and menstruation begins to occur. So a lot of the time people have this belief that adolescence is filled with mood swings and risky behavior. It's something that's been widely held since the early 1900s, but evidence from other cultures suggests that this is not always the case. So despite the fact that everyone, talks about moody teens, it's not necessarily as much of a hallmark of adolescence as it might be kind of typically seen. So adolescence is a time when teens must learn to control their emotions and to construct a healthy social identity for themselves. One of the most powerful strategies they can use for dealing with negative emotions is cognitive reframing, or looking at our experiences through a different frame. And this is something that I talk about again when we go through the treatments and therapies chapter for mental illness, but cognitive reframing can be very, very helpful in terms of dealing with negative emotions. So for example, and this is just kind of throwing it out there, but say somebody got into a car accident and totaled their car. They might be really upset, their car got beat up, they can't drive it anymore, and they might have a lot of negative feelings about that. But if they're able to kind of reframe it in the light of, well, I was wanting to get a new vehicle anyway, and now I have a chance to. I know it's very simplistic, but that is an example of cognitive reframing. So basically trying to take something that's negative and kind of see it in a different light, see it through a different lens. The ability to reframe is critical to another very important skill, which is the ability to delay gratification, which is putting off immediate temptation in order to focus on longer-term goals. And this behavior is something that can be learned. It's very important in terms of our development. It's associated with a lot of really positive outcomes. There is a test that they do for children to test whether or not they're able to delay gratification. It's called the marshmallow test. So basically giving a child one marshmallow and telling them that if they wait so long to eat it, they can have another. Instead, they can have 2 marshmallows. But they can either choose to eat it right away or to wait and kind of get that bigger reward. And that's a very simple test of the ability to delay gratification. So are they able to put off the positive feelings associated with eating the marshmallow in order to gain another one? And so that's something that is done as a test, because as I mentioned, delayed gratification is something that's really associated with a lot of positive outcomes. So we actually do see differences in terms of the brain development of adolescents as well. Researchers have shown that adolescents are prone to behaving impulsively and making risky decisions. Of course, there are a lot of different factors that contribute to these behaviors. We know that peer pressure is a very real thing, and peers are definitely seen as the largest influence in an adolescent's life. Unfortunately, teenage culture a lot of the time kind of glorifies risk, and they're gaining an increased sense of freedom in terms of being able to kind of go out with friends and maybe be left alone at home after school and things like that. And they still have a developing brain. So the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontmost part of our brain and is the one that's most highly associated with kind of logic and reasoning abilities, more complex thought, that one is still continuing to develop through adolescence and into young adulthood. So it's still not fully formed at that point. One key factor, as I mentioned, in taking risk is other teenagers. It's that peer influence, and you know, peers time and time again have been shown to be one of those most influential factors in terms of the behavior and success and things like that of other teens and adolescents. So we actually see that when teens are playing a driving video game with other teens, they crash more than when they're playing the same game alone, and more than when adults play the game. So it's really interesting. It seems like when their friends are around, it kind of eggs them on to maybe take a few more risks. If you look at the graphs here, you know, it pretty much, it's over doubled the amount of kind of crashes they're having when they're with their friends rather than when they're alone. And young adults, you know, they're still showing a little bit of an increase, but by the time you reach full adulthood, there's very little difference between whether you're alone or with friends. So it's kind of an indicator of just how powerful that peer influence can be. So now I want to talk briefly about moral development. I actually find this really interesting. So when we talk about morals, we're talking about having a sense of right and wrong. So one of the questions you might ask is, how do adolescents gain this sense? The most influential theory that we see is proposed by Lawrence Kohlberg, and it's known as his stages of moral reasoning. So basically he would say that as we grow and as we develop, we go through kind of these different stages of moral reasoning, and at each stage, the factors that we base our decision on vary. So he would say that, you know, as a young child, and, you know, even probably going up towards adolescence, you might exhibit what's known as pre-conventional morality. So it's characterized by self-interest in seeking reward or avoiding punishment. So that pre-conventional morality is considered very basic, and it's egocentric. So like I said, a lot of the times you will see it in young children. And so we want to apply each of these to what's known as the trolley dilemma. I'm sure you've probably all heard of it before, but basically it's stating that there's a train or a trolley coming down the track, and there is one person, you know, like there's a split in the track, and on one side of the track there's one person, and on the other split in the track there's 5 people. And the train is hurtling towards the group with 5 people. Do you intervene and flip the track so that only the one person is killed? Or do you continue, like, let it continue on its way, knowing that, you know, 5 people will be killed if you do so? And so there's a lot of different decisions to be made in this scenario. So, you know, some people say, well, you know, if I choose to flip the switch, then I'm taking responsibility for that one person who died. Whereas other people would say, well, you know, the lives of 5 exceed the value of the life of the one. And there isn't really a simple solution or an answer for this. It is something that's meant to be kind of a really thought-provoking scenario. But based on the different stages of moral reasoning, we can see that there will typically be different applications in terms of that trolley dilemma. So somebody who is in that stage of pre-conventional morality, where they're basically only doing things for their own self-interest and either to get a reward or avoid a punishment, they will probably say, I would not flip the trolley track switch because I would get in trouble. So they're not thinking about the people, they're not really thinking about the situation. They know that if they do it, they might get in trouble, and therefore they're acting in their own self-interest and saying, no, I wouldn't flip the switch. The next stage is conventional morality, and this one, as a child grows and, transitions into adolescence and beyond, they may begin to exhibit this kind of morality. And it's important to note that some people will stay kind of within that conventional morality stage for their whole life. Not everyone will reach that kind of final stage of post-conventional morality. But in conventional morality, you're basically regarding social conventions and rules as the guidelines for appropriate moral behavior. So now we're not worried about, I won't do it because I get in trouble, or I do it because I get rewarded. Now we're worried about the social norms and social conventions. So directives from people like parents, teachers, and the law are basically then used as guidelines for moral behavior. So somebody who's in that conventional stage of morality would probably say, I would not flip the switch. It's illegal to kill, and if I willfully intervened, I would probably violate the law. So it's no longer about, I don't want to do it because I'll get in trouble, simply kind of focusing on the self. This one does involve a bit more kind of logic and reasoning, but it still kind of tends to err towards what's socially considered acceptable. So I wouldn't do it because I might be breaking a law, and then I don't want to break that law. That goes against my moral code. And then finally, you have post-conventional morality. And this one is the one where it gets very kind of abstract and interesting. So someone who has attained post-conventional morality would basically consider rules and laws as being relative. So they're more about kind of the greater good. The right and wrong are being determined by more abstract principles of justice and rights. And so somebody who's in that post-conventional stage of morality, they might say they would flip the switch. And their reasoning would be the value of the 5 lives exceeds that of the 1, so saving them is the right thing to do, even if it means I'm killing one person who would otherwise not have died. So in their mind, it doesn't have to do with the law, it doesn't have to do with self-interest, it has to do with kind of the greater good. And so that one is kind of the highest level in terms of what Kohlberg believed that you can obtain with respect to your moral reasoning abilities. So another researcher named Jonathan Haidt, he introduced a social intuitionist model of morality, which states that our moral decisions are largely based on how we feel, not what we think. So when we're talking about Kohlberg's theory, he was very much in kind of involving logic and decision making and cognition into his moral reasoning ability. Whereas Jonathan Haidt would say that a lot of it has to do with how we feel. So if we expose somebody to something that makes them feel disgusted, then it might lead them to make more severe judgments of moral violations. And he would say basically it's only after we make the decision that most people engage in a more thoughtful and reflective reasoning. So that we tend to act with our emotions first, and then our kind of cognitions follow. And the development of key moral emotions has been linked to the extent at which one has had healthy social relationships right from birth. So again, because this is kind of a socially based model, he would say that your attachment styles and the relationships that you've had in your life will be reflected in the way that you kind of react to certain situations and different scenarios, and whether or not you consider them to be kind of morally right or morally wrong. Finally, I'm going to talk very briefly about social development. So a major issue that's faced by adolescents is the formation of an identity, which is essentially just a clear sense of what kind of a person you are. So as an adolescent, you're going through a very influential time in your life where you're learning about all these different options, you're kind of deciding who you want to be, what career you might want to pursue, where you might want to live, where you want to go to school. There's so many decisions to be made about who you are and what you wish to achieve. So identity basically encompasses all of that. Who you are, what types of people you belong with, and what role you should play in society. So Erikson, if you remember him from the last module, he described the stage of adolescence as involving the crisis of identity versus role confusion. So in this stage, the adolescent is seeking to define who they are. It's exactly what it sounds like. They're searching to find their identity, who they are and who they want to become, without getting confused about what their role is and what they should be hoping to do. Forming an identity is so important that adolescents may actually experience several identity crises before they reach young adulthood. It's okay if you're an adolescent or even a young adult. We have this category now that we're starting to consider emerging adult, between say 18 and 24 years of age, and it's okay if you're at that point in your life and you don't really know who you are yet or what you want to do. That's what that period is for. It's for making those decisions and trying new things. And so it's normal and almost healthy in a way for an adolescent and a young adult to have those identity crises in order to be able to really determine who they want to be and what they want to do. But above all else, as I mentioned earlier, friendships are a major priority for most adolescents. Friendships generally take place in the broader social context of cliques or crowds, and those friends, those peers, will be one of the greatest influences typically on your behavior and your achievements. Finally, many psychologists believe that shame and other negative emotions are connected to social rejection. So it has actually been proven that being socially rejected can actually activate some of the same areas as physical pain. And so just as a security from having the need to belong satisfied can help us lead to empathy and moral behaviors. So if you do have those good relationships, you tend to have that empathy for others and to kind of want to help out and be a moral person. The insecurity from not feeling as though one belongs can actually lead to violence and to really negative outcomes. Romantic relationships tend to begin during adolescence. It's been shown that between 40 to 50% of Canadian teens ages 15 to 19 report having had sexual intercourse. And same-sex sexual encounters are also very common and typically occur early in adolescence. Unfortunately, although sexual exploration is a normal part of adolescence, it can at times be dangerous. There are many Canadian teenagers that report having experienced psychological or sexual aggression against them by their romantic partner. So it is very important at that stage in your life to, really have people you trust, adults who you can talk to, and hopefully, a good education in place that's able to warn you about those difficulties and things that might be encountered. And that's why I think it's so important that schools, educate about healthy relationships and sexual education and stuff like that, because there can be really negative experiences if somebody isn't adequately prepared for them. And that is the end of Module 3. So hopefully you enjoyed it. I know it wasn't as long as the others, but still definitely some good information in there to keep in mind. Probably in terms of testing, it would be more multiple choice type questions than anything, but definitely keep some of those things like the stages of moral reasoning and the things that are associated with the onset of puberty and adolescence in mind, because they are an important part of life. Even though we don't have as much to talk about here as we do with some of the childhood stuff, it is still really important to keep in mind all the changes that are occurring during this period. So thanks for listening, and I will talk to you in the last video.